got a gun and brought it into this country on a vehicle ferry. Now, the practicalities are not every vehicle and not every person is going to be searched when they come into this country. Of course, it's against the law, but the realities are not everyone's going to be searched, and he got back with a gun.
It was certainly astonishing that somebody who had made threats to kill was able to obtain that weapon and then was able to leave the country and come back into the UK with it.
On the 31st of August 2005, Pesh appeared at Tower Bridge Magistrates Court to stand trial for harassing Claire.
Mr. Pesh, you are charged with the harassment of Claire Bernal under Section 2 of the Protection from Harassment Act 1997. How do you plead?
Guilty.
When I met Mr. Pesh at court, he initially did not want to change his plea to that of guilty. I explained to him at length the strength of the evidence, that there was no motivation at all for any of the witnesses to make up anything against him, and that it was my view that the case was very strong against him. And after hearing my view, he then decided that he would plead guilty. And that was the first time, I think you could say, he really, from my point of view, accepted that he had done something wrong.
At this time, the case is adjourned for pre-sentencing reports. Mr. Pesh, you are ordered to reappear on September the 21st. All options remain open to the court.
She phoned me that afternoon and she sounded elated, and she said, "Mum, now finally I can put the whole unpleasant episode to bed." She said he'll get a minimal sentence, so there's no reason at all why he should be angry towards me.
But the ordeal was far from over. Despite previously breaching his bail conditions and despite admitting harassment, Pesh was granted bail once again. No one could have predicted he was planning murder, but Claire's mother now believes there were warning signs.
I found out from Harvey Nichols that they were so concerned about Claire's safety that they had put together a file of comments from people who knew Claire and knew Pesh, and that he'd actually asked a part-time member of staff who was a trainee lawyer what the maximum sentence for murder was.
The fact that Pesh covertly asked someone what possibly the sentence might be for murder is absolutely terrifyingly a high-risk warning sign. It is a beacon saying that this person must be seriously contemplating, what will happen to me if I do this.
On September the 13th, 2005, less than 2 weeks after pleading guilty to harassing Claire, Michael Pesh walked into Harvey Nichols. He was high on cocaine and armed with the semi-automatic gun he'd bought in Slovakia.
He went behind the counter where Claire was standing and approached her from behind and discharged one shot into the back of her head. She obviously collapsed. He then discharged 3 shots into her face, perhaps to deliberately disfigure her. He then discharged a further shot into the ceiling, and then he killed himself.
The murder itself was carried out with almost military precision. He knew where Claire worked because obviously he'd worked there himself and knew where her store was. It was utterly ruthless. It was incredibly aggressive, and I think it was deeply shocking for everybody who heard about it.
As soon as they told me what had happened, I knew it was Pesh. I just knew. I said, "It's Pesh." And I went into a state of shock.
The inquest into Claire's death opened in November 2005. Claire's mother insisted it should be extended to see if the authorities had overlooked vital evidence about the state of mind of her daughter's killer.
Why should Claire just be blown away, just like that? I felt as if I had to carry on Claire's battle. I'd be letting Claire down by not getting to the bottom of everything.
The inquest focused on a variety of different aspects. Firstly, how did Pesh bring the gun into the country? Should the Customs and Excise have prevented that from happening? Could the police have done more to protect Claire?
It emerged that the police officer in charge of Claire's case had a high workload and had received limited training in how to deal with domestic violence.
The inquest was a very emotional hearing. At one point, the young female police officer who handled the case told how she discovered that Claire had been murdered. And at one point, the hearing was halted whilst she was comforted. She broke down in tears. It was very evident that that female police officer had worked very hard to try to protect Claire.
You cannot have a system whereby you have a police officer who has 1 day's training in domestic violence with over 20 to 25 cases to deal with, and think that Claire was adequately protected. Of course she wasn't. Of course she wasn't.
What they did find out was that a 124D form was not filled in by the initial investigating officer. That form helps officers establish the threat that a man poses to someone if he is thought to be a stalker or involved in a hate crime. However, the inquest did establish that even if that form had been filled in, because Pesh had no previous convictions, that he was, in all probability, a low risk, and that is the way he was assessed.
The coroner concluded that the police weren't to blame, and that, even if the form had been filled in, Michael Pesh would have probably still carried out his plan to kill Claire. He ruled that Claire was unlawfully killed and that her death could not have been anticipated.
The term stalking conjures up many perceptions, unfortunately not all of them correct.
Since Claire's death, the police have increased specialist stalking training and are now examining the way they assess danger to stalking victims.
Clearly what we have seen is some examples, including that of Claire Bernal, where there's been some tragedies that on reflection the police service has had to ask some serious questions. Did we get it right? The difficulty we've had with stalking and harassment, and I think some of the high-profile cases that we've seen in recent years has shown us, that on occasion we've been trying to apply the similar sort of questions, a similar sort of risk assessment that we've been using in domestic abuse, and often it just doesn't apply.
The Association of Chief Police Officers are now working on ways to identify the specific dangers posed by stalkers to people like Claire.
We've employed leading psychologists to work with ACPO and work with the police service to try and ensure that we can ask a series of questions that will help us identify at a very early stage whether someone is at a heightened state of risk or a lower state of risk, and therefore we're confident in the future we can ask those questions and be able to identify them.
Michael Pesh, 12th July 1975.
At least one leading psychiatrist says if Pesh had been subject to such specialist assessments, Claire's death may have been avoided.
There were various characteristics in the Claire Bernal case which would, had they been assessed, have given rise to particular concern. Firstly, this man was persistent. 50% of harassment cases stopped within 2 weeks. His did not. Secondly, he was working in the same place as Miss Bernal. In the literature, this is an important risk factor. Thirdly, he was making threats to kill her. And fourthly, an important fact about him is that he had military service and was familiar with firearms. In terms of the risk assessments that are made by stalking clinics and stalking experts, this would have flagged up this particular case as one worthy of particular attention.
The case of Claire Bernal hit the headlines because it happened here at a world-famous department store. But the reality is that every week 2 women are killed by a current or former partner. And it's estimated that 1/5 of all women will be stalked at some stage during their lifetime. It is these figures which have driven Claire's mother to take matters into her own hands.
I was very shocked at hearing the statistics. Since Claire, I've learnt about another world that we live in, and I've been cocooned, and I've cocooned my children, wrapped them in cotton wool, and it's my deepest regret that I trusted the system to look after Claire. You have to fight.
Yeah, you've got to fight.
Tricia has now become close friends with Carol and Stella, whose daughters were both also stalked, then killed by ex-boyfriends. The three have now set up a fund to raise awareness of the dangers of stalking.
The reason that we're all doing this is that we truly believe we can